Hey, what's up, A-Push kids? We're back for our next lecture in AP US History. Today, we're going to be covering topic 8.4, the American economy after 1945. We have two learning objectives today. Our first one, 8D, explain the causes of economic growth in the years after World War II. Our second one is learning objective 8E, explain the causes and effects of the migration of various groups of Americans after 1945. Our first key idea today says a burgeoning private sector. That means a growing, very fast rate. Federal spending, the baby boom, and technological developments helped spur economic growth. Now, much like the 1920s, the end of World War II is going to lead to an era of wealth and spending in the 1950s. Now, most economists who had forecast a post-war depression were proved wrong because they had failed to consider consumer pent-up accumulation of needs and wants. People had gone without many goods for so long that by the late 1940s, with more than $135 billion in savings from defense work, service pay, and investment in war bonds, Americans suddenly had money to spend. They snatched up everything from automobiles to houses. And after a brief period of post-war economic readjustment, the American economy boomed. The demand for goods and services outstripped the supply and increased production, which created new jobs. Now, judging from the graphs shown on the left, many Americans prospered in the late 1950s in what the economist John Kenneth Galbraith called the affluent society. The Cold War contributed to economic growth. And concern over economic expansion kept American defense spending high and people employed, as well as foreign aid programs provided another boost to the American economy by helping nations in Western Europe recover from the war. Now, people during this time rushed to buy new goods as consumerism returned to America in the 1950s, because for the first time since the 1920s, Americans had money and access to consumer goods. New goods like cars, TVs, hi-fi record players, etc. all helped to fuel this particular drive. In addition to this, credit also became widely available. First credit card created in 1950. And we can see Americans are spending money like they never had before. In addition to this, advertisers are going to use newspaper ads, radios, new TV commercials to market their goods to Americans. And consumer products of all types will become available. In addition to this, the American economy will also become homogenized as franchises offered people across the country the exact same product, such as Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's burgers, Dunkin' Donuts. We all see these fast food chains begin in the 1950s. In addition to this, Americans produced a baby boom in the 1950s, and this is the largest generation in U.S. history. Fun fact, you don't have to write it down though. 1957, a baby's born every 7 seconds in the United States. That's crazy. My parents were born in 1952 and 1953 respectively. Certainly part of this baby boom. Now, the baby boom is mostly by the return of soldiers from war, and this leads to an increase in marriages and a rise of birth rates. But it's also due in part just to the growing affluence of the United States. Now, what we generally see is that people have more babies when economic times are good, and people don't have as many when economic times are bad. Now, the baby boom itself also helped to increase consumerism. It's going to lead to a demand for new baby products, for new schools, and new homes for growing families. You can see some of the toys, like the whole Fisher-Price set becomes available. Now, did you guys have any of these? I can tell you, I had this. I still have this. Those things last forever. We get new childcare products. Dr. Benjamin Spock was like the must-have book of the time about how to raise a kid. You know, kind of as ubiquitous as the what to expect when you're expecting book that every single expectant mother these days seems to read. School enrollment goes up right here. Now, in addition to this, we also see the car become incredibly popular during this time period, right? And just like the 20s, the car is kind of synonymous with this decade. We buy cars in record numbers. Now, the growth of the suburbs, which we'll talk about in just a second, is going to help with this. If you're living away from the city, you got to have a car to get to your job. In addition to this, we're going to have creative advertising, cheap credit, cheap gasoline at this time. All of these things kind of lead to this car boom during the 1950s. In addition to this, the Interstate Highway Act, created in 1956, that we talked about in our previous lecture, adds 41,000 miles of expressways, making it easy for people to travel across the country. Now, during the time, automobile companies make these huge, flashy cars. Notice the huge fins coming off those back of those things. These things are amazing. Now, technology also during this time period is television. Now, television is the new form of technology during the 1950s, and everybody's got one. And Americans love their TV. Just like in the 1920s, Americans had loved their radio. Television booms. Americans watch comedies, news reports, westerns, variety shows. You know, for instance, you've got I Love Lucy, The Lone Ranger, The Ed Sullivan Show, all become incredibly popular during this particular time. And TV ownership is pretty widespread. It's very ubiquitous. 9% in 1950 to 90% by 1960. And you can see just on the charts, not only the households with TV sets and how that's going up, but also the average daily hours of TV viewing. You know, Americans, by 2000 were watching on average almost 7 hours of TV per day. Businesses took advantage of this by oftentimes using television to advertise their goods to buyers. Leading us now to key idea number 2. As higher educational opportunities and new technologies rapidly expanded, increasing social mobility encouraged the migration of the middle class to the suburbs and of many Americans to the South and West. The sunbelt region emerged as a significant political and economic force. So higher education and new technology increased social mobility. So some of those new technologies included like cars and TVs and other consumer products in the post-war world, and this increased the standard of living and made people feel like they were in a higher class than what they had been in before. In addition to this, higher education is also going to help out. The GI Bill of Rights is going to vastly increase the educational attainment of returning soldiers. As a result of this, many Americans moved during the 1950s. Now, the suburbs in the 1950s are going to boom. The majority of Americans are going to work in cities, but they're going to want the security and the familiarity of the suburbs for their families. Suburbs are going to offer peace of mind, affordable homes, good schools, and people will flock there by the tens of thousands. Now, helping all this out was the passage of new laws, such as the GI Bill of Rights. Now, the GI Bill of Rights helped the movement to the suburbs in 2 ways. Number one, it offered cheap loans for new homes. And so returning soldiers could afford to take out a loan for a home in the suburbs very cheaply. But in addition to this, it also helped for money for college. And so many returning GIs, many of them had not even, or just graduated high school, or some of them hadn't even graduated high school, could now go on to college. And new colleges also start to open up during this time, allowing for even more educational opportunities. And with more education, they can earn more money. And even the ones that couldn't afford to move to the suburbs, even with those loans, after going through college now could with those better paying jobs. Now here's a couple pictures of those suburban homes. They're not big, right? The 1950 suburban home is not what we may think of today. They were very, very small. Sometimes they were referred to as kind of salt box homes, just kind of their boxy nature that they have there. Very kind of simple floor plans. They're just like two, maybe a 3rd bedroom house. Not very big, not incredibly spacious. Now, they were popular though, and they were easy and cheap to build, and led to the development of massive communities. Now, the most famous one is what we call Levittown. It was built by Levin & Sons Construction Company, and it's huge. I mean, it's kind of almost what like Bentwater looks like, where Seven Hills looks like from the air, but smaller homes, and all built exactly identical to one another. In fact, my aunt, my great aunt, I'm sorry, my grandmother's sister, lived in Levittown, and all the houses looked pretty much exactly the same. Now, the increase in suburbs is going to change American lives. We see the need for not only cars and highways expand, but we also see like churches, schools, grocery stores, shopping centers are all built to service the suburbs. And Atlanta is a perfect example of that. Atlanta was built for the suburbs and because of the suburbs. Now, the migration to the suburbs, however, was mostly white families. White flight to the suburbs left African Americans primarily in urban areas. And in addition to this, not only was it that African Americans couldn't afford necessarily to move to the suburbs, many of them could, but local laws as well as real estate agents oftentimes use what was called redlining to prevent African Americans from moving to certain suburban neighborhoods. Now, not only were Americans moving to the suburbs, but they were also moving to the Sun Belt. Now, this is due for two reasons. Number one, the spread of air conditioning technology is going to encourage the move to the Sun Belt and the American South and to the American West. And partly because with air conditioning, you can now tolerate living in those hot and humid conditions. I would not live in Georgia if air conditioning did not exist. I would have told my wife she was crazy when she said, hey, let's move to Georgia. Now, in addition to this, many also went to places like California during the 1950s and 1960s because the aerospace industry, the defense industry as well, all had plenty of room to expand. In addition to this, and not on the slide, but also the growth and development of the U.S. military, especially during World War II and during the Cold War, is also going to bring a lot of people to the South. Most not only naval bases but army bases are located in the South. I mean, just think how big Fort Benning is, for instance, here in Georgia, and how important that is to the Columbus area. Now, this is going to have some pretty big implications, all right, for the South. So if you kind of look at the Sun Belt, the map here, all the numbers on that map represent the different population gains or losses. Notice that most of the states in the South right here are gaining very, very large numbers, 2 to 3 million people during this particular time from 1970 to 1980. But notice that places like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, they're all losing substantial populations. Now, this is going to have some fairly important political impacts on the United States over time, right? And so the impacts that it has, we can see directly in our electoral college. The electoral college, which elects the president, those numbers are tied to the population of those states. So for instance, just pay attention just to California right out here. So this is the 1948 election, okay? California is worth 25. And then we go to the 1960 election, now they're 32. Then you go to the 1972 election, now they're 45. And then 1996, they're at 54. And now I think they're at 55 to this day. So, I mean, they've gone up, gone up, gone up. I mean, just for another example, I mean, look at Florida. Florida may be even more dramatic, right? So Florida is 8 and 48, then becomes 10, then 17, then 25. Texas also goes up significantly during this time, from 23, to 32. But then if you look north, look at New York. And New York's located right up here. They're 47. Notice what's happening. They go to 45, then 41, then 33. And so what we start to see then is we start to see this shift in power, the locus of power, the center of power in the country shifts away from that northeast. It shifts away from New York. It shifts away from Massachusetts. It shifts away from Pennsylvania. And it moves to Florida. It moves to Texas. It moves to California. And this is one of the reasons why today California and Florida especially are so important in national elections. They're worth a lot, but they're also big swing states in terms of what's going on. So this major migration, this internal migration of people, has very, very important political consequences on the United States still to this day. All right, so that ends our lecture for today. Just a few kind of notes about the American economy during the 1950s. There's a lot of similarities to the 1920s, right? So you've got Cars are important. New technologies. It's TV, not the radio this time. Credit's big. People have tons of pent-up money to be able to spend, and they spend it. They have tons of babies, and they move. And so we see the movement to two places. They move to the suburbs, and then they move to the south. All right. And in the south, the southern people move to the suburbs as well. All right. So huge movements of people. The economy's amazing. But that's all my time for today. Don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button. And until next time, as always, go Pack.